School bully lays, hands on the wrong black boy. 10 seconds later, he never expected this. Under the polished floors and manicured traditions of Greyston Academy, something far older than textbooks lingered in the air. An invisible hierarchy built not just on wealth, but on legacy, color, and power. It was the kind of place where doors opened more for last names than for merit, and where silence had become its unwritten code. No one broke that silence, until Jackson did. He didn't wake up that morning planning to make history. He had AP Physics in third period and a makeup quiz to worry about. But life doesn't ask for your schedule when it decides to shake the ground beneath you. And for Jackson, it came in the form of Groar Whitman, 6'3", star linebacker, son of the board chairman, and a boy who'd never once been told no and had never learned the weight of his privilege. It started like it always did. A sneer, a shove, a muttered insult that didn't sound offensive to everyone, just to the ones who'd heard it all their lives. But that morning, when Groar stepped in front of Jackson, blocking his way with the entitlement of someone who thought the hallway was his birthright, something shifted. Maybe it was the way Jackson tightened the grip on his backpack strap. Maybe it was the years of swallowing slights and brushing off smirks. Maybe it was the quiet understanding that respect, once stolen, had to be taken back, not through rage, but through clarity and courage. Groar expected flinching. He got a storm instead. In one swift move, Jackson didn't just defend himself, he rewrote the moment. The hallway didn't just go quiet because a fight had broken out. It went quiet because for the first time, the spell was broken. The weight of generations, of boys like Jackson told to walk away, keep their heads down, blend in, was suddenly lifted, and in its place stood something new, an unshakable presence. 10 seconds. That's all it took. 10 seconds for power to change hands, for a school, a system, a story to unravel and rebuild. Jackson didn't just push back. He stepped into the space that had always been his, just waiting for him to claim it. In a world that too often measures worth by silence, he answered with strength, and the entire hallway, for once, listened. Groar didn't push Jackson because he was angry. Not really. He pushed him because he could, because somewhere along the way, in locker rooms and legacy dinners, in offhand remarks passed down like family heirlooms, Groar had learned that power isn't something you earn. It's something you assume. That when you're born into the right family, with the right skin, in the right zip code, you don't ask if the hallway belongs to you. You just take up space and expect others to move. The shove wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. That's the thing about power when it thinks no one's watching. It speaks in small gestures. A body stepped too close, a laugh a second too long, a hand that lingers just enough to remind you who's in charge. And in that moment, Groar wasn't bullying Jackson. He was reenacting a ritual, one that's been rehearsed in this country since the first black boy was told to lower his eyes and step aside. But what Groar failed to understand, what so many like him never do, is that these rituals, while inherited, aren't invincible. They wear thin clothes. They split at the seams. They forget that eventually someone will stop pretending not to notice. And that morning, Jackson didn't just notice. He drew a line, not with his fists, not with shouting, but with stillness. The kind of stillness that comes from knowing who you are, even when the world insists you forget. He stood there, eyes locked, unmoved, not just by the shove, but by the story it carried. And for a breathless moment, the hallway didn't see a student. I saw a question. What if the boy you thought would flinch didn't? What if the story doesn't play out the way it always has? What if dignity doesn't step aside this time? When Groar shoved Jackson, he thought he was reminding him of his place. but all he did was remind the room of something else, something older than power and louder than silence. He reminded them that not every tradition is worth preserving. Some need to be broken. Some, in the right hands, are. That morning, in a hallway built for heirs and obedience, one boy simply refused to move, and the entire weight of history wavered. They say you can hear a moment shift if you're quiet enough. And in that narrow, echoing corridor of Grayston Academy, time itself held its breath. Gror had never been touched, not like that, not questioned, not bested. He was the kind of boy that teachers turned a blind eye to and that students stepped aside for. A golden boy born into platinum halls, wearing his arrogance like a well-cut suit. He didn't just walk through school, he occupied it, like a monument to tradition no one dared confront. So when he shoved Jackson, it wasn't out of spite. It was choreography, a gesture rehearsed and repeated for years. Push the different one, watch him fold, laugh while everyone else looks away. But that morning, the rhythm skipped. Jackson didn't fold. He didn't shout. He didn't plead. What he did was something altogether more dangerous. He remained calm. Calm in a way that sends a ripple through the air, like pressure building before a storm. Then, with a motion too fast for the mind to register and too practiced to be lucky, he turned Gror's world upside down. Literally. The thud was real. So was the silence that followed. Gror hit the floor not just as a boy who lost balance, but as a symbol toppling off its pedestal. He'd always been untouchable, a name spoken with caution. But in 10 seconds, that untouchable myth shattered like porcelain. And what stood above him wasn't just a student. It was the story flipping. The hallway didn't cheer. Not yet. What came first was disbelief. The kind of collective silence that falls when something sacred is broken. And sacred it was. The unspoken understanding that boys like Gror always win. But that day, they didn't. Jackson didn't gloat. He didn't need to. What he had done couldn't be undone with detention slips or threats of suspension. He had shifted gravity. He had shown that fear only works until someone decides it doesn't. And in that breathless pause after the fall, the school wasn't just witnessing a fight. It was watching a legacy crumble and something new, raw, honest, inevitable, rise from the dust. There was a time, not long ago, when boys like Jackson were taught to walk carefully in places like Grayston Academy, not because they were weak, but because the world around them had decided they were fragile by design, to be tolerated, not seen, to be quiet, not heard. Their stories were often rewritten before they could even hold a pen. But something happened the day Jackson didn't look away. Something more lasting than the fall of a bully. In homes across the country, where newspapers still rest on porches and breakfast is shared before sunrise, older men sat forward in their chairs. Men who had lived through marches, boycotts, and quiet humiliations that no camera ever caught. They watched the grainy hallway footage of Jackson flipping Gror and felt something unfamiliar. Not rage, not pride exactly, but recognition. A heartbeat skipped. A lump formed. It wasn't just the move. It was the stillness before it. The clarity in Jackson's eyes. The restraint. The knowing. To them, this wasn't about a fight. It was about finally seeing someone do what they were told never to try. It was about daring to hold space in a world that had always asked them to shrink. Somewhere in the deep South, a grandfather turned down the radio and whispered, "That's how I felt when I refused to give up my seat." In a small town in Ohio, a retired teacher wiped his glasses and murmured, "That boy stood like the law hadn't been written yet." Jackson didn't set out to become a symbol. He didn't know that people who'd once been punished for standing up would feel healed watching him do it without apology. But he did something rare. He crossed a line and held it, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told to step back. And maybe Grohr thought he was just putting Jackson in his place. But what he didn't realize, what no one did at first, was that Jackson was already in his place, his rightful one, the center, the moment, and when he stood still, the rest of the world had to reckon with what that meant. Jackson didn't walk into Grayston Academy hoping to teach anyone a lesson. He wasn't looking to be admired, feared, or remembered. He just wanted to learn, to grow, to move through life without having to explain or defend the skin he was in. But the world doesn't often let boys like Jackson be ordinary. And so, the lesson found him instead. After that hallway moment, after Grohr hit the floor and silence hung heavy in the air, something shifted. Not just in the school, but in the people inside it. You might have expected Jackson to ride that wave of newfound attention, to let the glory sweep him up. He didn't, because he understood something most don't. Real power doesn't come from the roar. It comes from the responsibility that follows it. He saw the eyes on him change. Some were full of awe, others laced with resentment, and more than a few were hungry for something. Answers, explanations, a reason to feel brave by association. Jackson didn't owe them that. But still, he gave something more meaningful than a story. He gave purpose. In the days that followed, Jackson didn't just stand taller. He built something. A few younger students, quiet boys who had never dared to look anyone like Grohr in the eye, started sitting closer to him at lunch. One asked if he could teach him how to stay calm under pressure. Another said, "I didn't know we were allowed to fight back." Jackson started spending his afternoons in the old gym, not sparring, but listening. At first, it was just a few kids, then a dozen. He didn't teach them how to throw punches. He taught them how to hold their ground, how to breathe when the world tries to crush you small, how to recognize the line between reaction and intention. The gym became a sanctuary, not for violence, but for voice. Grohr stayed away. His absence said more than his presence ever did. Some kids said he was humiliated. Others claimed he was plotting a comeback. Jackson didn't care. He wasn't interested in enemies or revenge. What he had done was never about Grohr. It was about the invisible weight so many had carried for so long, and finally setting it down. And the lesson? It wasn't that the strong win. It was that strength can look like stillness. That courage can sound like silence. That dignity, when lived out loud, doesn't humiliate. It heals. Older staff members noticed the shift. Mr. Howard, the janitor who'd worked at Grayston longer than most students had been alive, started showing up to those gym sessions too. He'd nod quietly, mop in hand, his eyes glistening with something that looked like memory. One afternoon, he told Jackson, "You know, back in my day, we didn't dare speak up. You didn't just speak. You made the silence say something." Jackson never considered himself a leader. But leadership has a way of choosing you, especially when you carry it with humility. He wasn't interested in being the next headline. He wanted to be the reason someone else didn't feel alone. He wanted to plant something that would outlive the applause. And perhaps that's the most important part of this story, the part that doesn't go viral. The real victory wasn't the moment Grohr fell. It was the moment Jackson chose not to become him. Because too often, those who rise from injustice let the fire burn them hard. They become the very thing they swore to fight. But Jackson chose another path, the harder one, the one that heals what power once tried to steal, not just for himself, but for others too. He turned a hallway into a crossroads. He turned fear into a ripple of quiet resistance. And in doing so, He reminded an entire community of something they had forgotten, that sometimes the most radical act isn't to fight louder, it's to live better. Years from now, the hallway will be painted over, the lockers were replaced, the students changed, but somewhere in that school's foundation, there will be a crack, left by a boy who refused to be moved, not to make a scene, not to prove a point, but to reclaim something sacred, the right to stand without permission. That's what legacy looks like when it's earned, not inherited. It doesn't scream, it stays, and it speaks, even when no one's listening. Jackson didn't plan on becoming a symbol. He didn't wake up hoping to rewrite rules or challenge decades of quiet injustice. He only wanted to walk through that hallway like any other student, with peace in his chest and purpose in his step. But the world, especially in places like Grayston, doesn't always make space for boys like Jackson to be ordinary. And maybe that's why his stillness hit harder than any punch could have. Because what he did wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It wasn't showy. It was exact, honest, unapologetic. He met power, not with violence, but with the kind of presence that history remembers, not because it demanded attention, but because it refused to disappear. And in doing so, he showed that strength isn't always about overpowering someone. Sometimes it's about not letting them decide who you are. Jackson reminded us that resistance doesn't always wear armor. It sometimes wears a quiet stare, a deep breath, a refusal to move. He reminded us that there's something deeply human, deeply sacred about standing your ground, not for spectacle, not for revenge, but for dignity, for self-respect, for the generations behind you who weren't allowed to. And maybe the most powerful thing he did was what he didn't do. He didn't become like the one who hurt him. He didn't retaliate with bitterness. He didn't cling to the spotlight. He simply became the kind of young man the world needs more of. Calm, grounded, and unwilling to let fear define him. In today's world, where outrage often drowns out understanding, and reaction overshadows reflection, maybe what we need isn't another voice shouting. Maybe we need more people like Jackson, people who know when to speak, when to listen, and when to simply stand still and let the truth do the talking. This story isn't just about one boy in one hallway. It's about the choices we make when the world watches, and the ones we make when it doesn't. And if that moved something in you, if you felt even a flicker of recognition, of pride, of hope, then don't let it stop here. If this story spoke to you, even in a small way, don't let it fade. Remember to like and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories, meaningful stories just like this. I truly look forward to reading your comments. Every word you share is a spark that fuels me,